Why should you believe in creation and not evolution? I mean, scientifically speaking. Haven't we proven that evolution is a fact? Well, two of the supposed evidences for evolution are rock layers and the fossil record. It's said that it took millions of years to form the geologic column with all of the billions of fossils it contains. Now, if you search Google for how are fossils formed, the top answer tells you that most fossils were formed when an animal or plant dies in a watery environment. The soft tissue decomposes and the bones are slowly buried by mud and silt. Now, over time, it says, sediment builds over the top and hardens into rock. It lithifies.
First of all, Google is a search engine, not an authority. You can't simply Google something and pick the first result and assume that's the correct answer. Thankfully, the result that Google returned in this instance was decent enough, coming from an introductory level article from scienceviews.com. Yet that level should not be overstated. It's decent enough for the beginner, but isn't the pinnacle of science. Now, the article does state that most fossils are formed when a plant or animal dies in a watery environment and is buried in mud and silt, and then the hard organic materials are replaced with minerals during petrification. However, it also notes that there are many other forms of fossilization, such as karst fossilization, volcanic fossilization, and sap-based fossilization, to name 3 others. Just noting that the source that you have quoted does make this clear.
Now, this definition on how a fossil forms leaves out an important detail. The specimen must be buried deeply and rapidly for it to fossilize. So why don't we see fossils being formed routinely today? Well, because when a creature dies, its remains decay away as scavengers do their work. It has to be buried very quickly, or else there's nothing left to fossilize.
These are not the prerequisites for fossilization at all. They help, absolutely, but they're not required. Firstly, even if a body is scavenged, it can become fossilized. The only problem is the remains may only be partially fossilized or dispersed over a wide area, as bits are carried off by scavengers and deposited in places of varying suitability. Secondly, there are other ways for the body to be out of the reach of scavengers. If the animal dies in a hard-to-reach place, like on a cliff ledge after falling, or in the middle of a desert, that can make it difficult to reach, and then the hard remains may become buried at a later date and fossilized from there, as bones can survive some weathering. Then we have natural traps like brine pools, which are super saline wells at the bottom of the ocean which suffocates any sea creature that enters them. The result of this are creatures seemingly resting in the open, which attract even more scavengers to their doom. The video on screen displays such an example from the hot tub of despair, where a crab had climbed on top of a deceased arthropod, presumably to eat its fill, where it too fell victim to the brine and died. And the people exploring this phenomenon noted you can already see the sediment resting on top of its shell. And that will build up over time, and the brine pool will rise as the muscle growth which forms said pools grows taller and taller, and it will be buried. But as the sediment falls on these creatures over hundreds of years, it will build up around them, and their bodies will start to decay slowly, both hard and soft tissue, as the brine effectively pickles them, allowing minerals to petrify these organisms and turn them into fossils near perfectly. Now, these cases may be rarer, but they do happen and must be noted.
So is the slow and gradual process described in Google search results how most fossils formed in the past? Well, let's look at a few examples.
First, you only used one Google search result. Second, it only stated over time. And third, it was only talking about a single process of fossilization. But most importantly, the question as to whether a process is, quote, how most fossils are formed in the past, should never be followed directly by, quote, let's look at a few examples. The very usage of the word most denotes a typical, yet not universal, value. If you're going to start changing words to meet your assertions, we are going to have a very bad time.
In Australia, there's a rock formation that stretches about 300 miles, and it contains millions of jellyfish fossils. Now, if you've ever been to the beach and you've seen a jellyfish that's washed up on shore, you'll notice they don't last very long. Within a few hours, they become just an unsightly blob. But these millions of jellyfish are well preserved. They had to be buried quickly. The evolutionists who discovered them said they had to have been formed in less than 24 hours. Wow.
In trying to spot the actual argument here, I think I caught onto your game. You're set on playing a false equivocation where in one phrase you use fossilization to talk about the slow process of mineralization, and in another you use it very dishonestly to simply refer to burial. That allows you to pretend that a quick burial, which you have called fossilization, proves the quick mineralization of actual fossilization. Burial and fossilization are not synonymous. They are not interchangeable. Jellyfish needing to be buried within 24 hours of death does not equate to a jellyfish needing to be mineralized in that 24 hours. We have something known as casting, which is exactly as it sounds. When an organism dies and is buried under sediment, it can become encased inside a perfect press of itself. Now, if that sediment has settled, it can hold firm even as the organic material decays completely, leaving just an empty cavity, a mold. This cavity then fills up with minerals at a later date, long after the organic material has decayed. The difference between this and permineralization, which is the most common form of fossilization, is the detail. When something goes through permineralization, what is happening is minerals fill in the gaps between the remains, typically bone, shell, or wood at this point, as it decays. This happens when there is organic material still present. The amount of detail this can result in is incredible, in that it can even preserve the general structure at the cellular level. Cast fossils, meanwhile, lack these fine details as all the material had decayed before fossilization could take place. Cast fossils, meanwhile, lack these fine details as the material had decayed before fossilization could occur. Often these fossils are just faint shadows on the rock with maybe some detail due to varying thickness throughout the body, resulting in larger cavities in those areas and therefore more mineral, so when it's all compacted down under vast pressure, thicker parts look darker. So that's not to say that you can't get details in cast fossils, as you can get some impressive stuff, particularly of leaves. It's also not impossible for soft tissue to go through permineralization. As demonstrated earlier with the brine pool, there are instances where even soft tissue can be preserved long enough to result in that sort of fossilization. It's just less common, so bringing out a few examples won't refute that. However, either way, all we need for jellyfish fossils are sediments like sand, silt or mud, and water for an animal which lives in the ocean. It's really not that surprising when you actually think about it.
Now, fossil fish have been found with their lunch half-eaten and still sticking out of their mouths. An ichthyosaur was fossilized giving birth. And millions of clams have been found buried and fossilized in a closed position. Now, when a clam dies, its muscles relax and it opens up. So these clams were alive when they were catastrophically buried. Obviously, these creatures were all fossilized very quickly.
That was the clearest demonstration of your sleight in hand, so I think I'll just play this again.
So these clams were alive when they were catastrophically buried. Obviously, these creatures were all fossilized very quickly. As we can see from these examples, the key is not long periods of time. The key is the right conditions.
The examples either died and were buried rapidly, like the fish and the ichthyosaur, or were simply buried alive and died soon after, like the clams. There is nothing about the process of fossilization that takes issue with that fact. Rather, as you mentioned earlier, it actually helps fossilization occur. But that does not then mean that this proves some mega mineralization, aka fast fossilization. a quick burial proves a quick burial, and since burial is not synonymous with fossilization, that's all it proves. The clams stayed shut because they were being forced shut by the sand long after they had died and began to fossilize. These weren't flash fossilizations like you are attempting to assert.
The Bible describes a time in history when the conditions were just right for burial and fossilization on a massive scale. Around 4,000 years ago, God judged man's wickedness with a global flood. This catastrophic event would have ripped up miles of sediment, redepositing it in layers. Billions of organisms, most of them marine creatures, would have gotten trapped and buried under all this sediment. These conditions would be perfect to form the fossils that we find today. It doesn't take millions of years to form fossils. They don't provide support for evolutionary ideas about long ages. But when interpreted through the lens of a biblical worldview, rapid mineralization makes perfect sense. Just one more scientific reason that you shouldn't believe in geologic evolution. It takes a lot of faith. I'm David Rives. Truly, the heavens declare the glory of God.
Well, this is all rather irrelevant as we don't date the Earth using paleontology. We use nuclear physics. Not to mention the most basic understanding of geological layers disproves your argument, as if it really was the result of a cataclysmic flood, why aren't the denser materials found in the bottom layers? Why are the fossils all perfectly ordered when compared to the phylogenetic tree, aka the genetic tree of life, which maps our ancestry forensically? How do you explain the fact that many civilizations went on growing right through this period with not so much as a mention of a flood that covered all the lands? Not to mention the fact that supposedly they'd all died, and yet somehow they just decided to keep on growing. When you say,
but when interpreted through the lens of a biblical worldview,
what you really mean is, if you reject all the science on the matter in favor of my religious-led ignorance. What you have presented is in no way scientific and does not demonstrate that either an atheist or a person that accepts the reliability of evolutionary theory requires faith. Now, seeing as your video was a little on the short side, I think we have time for another. So let's see what you have to say about the Cambrian explosion.
Why should you believe in creation and not evolution? I mean, scientifically speaking. Haven't we proven that evolution is a fact? Well, near the bottom of the fossil record is a layer of rock known as the Cambrian. This layer is bursting with fossils of all kinds of creatures, many of which look very bizarre to us today.
I think it may be important to note the geological timescale of the Cambrian and the fossil record in general, because David isn't giving a very accurate picture whatsoever. The earliest confirmed fossil we have is of cyanobacteria, dating back as far as 2.7 billion years. These sun-loving bacteria clump together in huge colonies as they photosynthesized, creating oxygen, and caught passing sediment like a net. This sediment formed layer upon layer of rock and mineral, which given time created stromatolites. And there is some evidence of earlier colonies dating back 3.45 billion years, however, unlike the other example, they're in no way conclusive. But let's be generous and take the 2.7 billion year mark. That means the Earth, which was formed 4.5 billion years ago, was lifeless for the first 1.8 billion years, and then 2.7 billion years ago, which by the way is 2,724 million years ago, we suddenly get the start of the fossil record. The Cambrian explosion, meanwhile, only occurred 0.54 billion or 541 million years ago, and lasted around 0.02/0.025 billion or 20 to 25 million years. So you missed the first 2,183 million years of the fossil record that exists between the first single-celled organisms and the start of the Cambrian explosion, which occurred a mere 541 million years ago. That doesn't place the Cambrian anywhere near the bottom of the fossil record, like you have stated. It's still a hell of a lot of time for us, but life had been evolving for billions of years by that point as both single and multicellular organisms prior the Cambrian explosion. Entire groups of organisms such as the Ediacaran biota, which consisted of many strange examples of fauna, diversified and then went extinct at the start of the Cambrian explosion. They themselves had radiated out to a vast array of diversity only 33 million years before the Cambrian explosion in the lesser-known geological and evolutionary event, the Avalon explosion. So hopefully this gives you a little more grounding in the event we are talking about.
Now, at the time of Charles Darwin, 150 years ago, no fossils were known to exist below the Cambrian layer. The Cambrian fossils seemed to explode from nowhere. Darwin recognized that this Cambrian explosion was a huge challenge to his position. Well, after over a century and a half of research, the Cambrian explosion is an even bigger mystery to evolutionary researchers.
And the basis for that claim comes from where exactly? We have Precambrian fossils dating back 2,183 million years prior the Cambrian explosion. We have also developed new models discussed such as punctuated equilibrium, which views evolution as taking place rapidly in certain conditions before settling once again. This is contrasted by phyletic gradualism, in which evolution is constant and sustained. Now, I personally hold to a compromise of the two, so phyletic gradualism, which can suddenly speed up due to environmental factors such as an evolutionary trait opening up entirely new niches or in events such as mass extinctions. The field has moved on a lot, and whilst it got off to a rocky start, the field has made a lot of progress which you just seem to have ignored completely. Take for example oxygen levels leading up and during both the Avalon explosion and the Cambrian explosion, for which I'd like to thank Wildwood Clare for drawing my attention to. Her work has very much been the foundation for this video. The chart on screen displays estimated oxygen levels over the history of the Earth. The red bar, which I've just added, represents the Cambrian period, and the yellow bar represents the Avalon period. Now, this would suggest that increasing oxygen levels could have played a part in the sudden radiation of life, both in the Avalon period and the Cambrian period, as well as possibly explains the appearance of hard-shelled creatures during the latter Cambrian explosion. There may be some lag time involved, i.e., time from when the oxygen appears and life suddenly radiated.
You see, more and more fossils have been found throughout the Cambrian. We now know that every major group of organisms, including vertebrates, existed at this time the layers were deposited. That means that every major body plan existed before the Cambrian.
Notice that when David mentions every major group of organisms, he fails to specify what he means by this taxonomically, but offers us the example of vertebrates and invertebrates before he then goes on to switch to every major body plan existed before the Cambrian. These are two wildly different claims that have once again been falsely equivocated. When it comes to the Cambrian explosion, we see the emergence of most major types of phyla. Not before, not at the start, but during this 20 to 25 million year period. The phyla we belong to is among those that evolved early on during the Cambrian, which is Chordata, making us chordates. Chordata became a phylum with the development of 5 features, including a notochord, a dorsal nerve cord, pharyngeal slits, an endostyle, and a post-anal tail. The notochord is simply a cartilage-like rod running along the body and would evolve to become part of our spinal cord. The same is true of the dorsal nerve cord, which was different because all other life had their nervous system on the belly side. Ours moved to the dorsal side and would merge together with the notochord to form an actual vertebrate column. For this reason, all vertebrates are chordata, but not all chordata are vertebrates. That's how large and general phyla are as a taxonomical category. Our phyla contains both vertebrates and invertebrates. That's what science means by major groups evolving in the early Cambrian. Now, the first true vertebrates would evolve later on in that geological period, around 15 to 16 million years into the Cambrian explosion. You can't just ignore the fact that the Cambrian lasted between 20 and 25 million years. Now, pharyngeal slits still survive in us during the fetal period as the pharyngeal pouch. In fish, this would become gills, whilst in us it becomes other features of our neck and surrounding tissue. The endostyle, meanwhile, is thought to be the precursor of our thyroid gland. And last of all, the post-anal tail is exactly what it says on the tin and still exists in us with the coccyx, that little bone which sticks out the base of your spine and can be incredibly painful if you sit down the wrong way and something bumps against it. But moving on to your claim that
means that every major body plan existed before the Cambrian.
This just doesn't add up. Things which our phyla alone have evolved since the Cambrian include the vertebrate jaw, which didn't evolve until the Silurian period, along with bony fish, which gave our ancestors a base skeleton. Sharks, meanwhile, wouldn't evolve until the Devonian period 419 million years ago. Devonian literally translating to age of fish, and it was during this same geological epoch that vertebrates evolved advanced fin muscles and primitive foot structures and took their first steps onto land. From there, ancient amphibians and then ancient reptiles evolved, which then further branched out into three main categories, which were the modern reptiles, the avian reptiles, aka the dinosaurs which would become modern-day birds, and a small group of mammalian reptiles that would further evolve and then radiate into mammal species, including human beings. This is a chordate, and so is this, and these, and of course, so are we. So the claim that every major body plan existed before the Cambrian or even during the Cambrian is incredibly dishonest, as it ignores anything beyond the most simple of eel-like fish with no jaw, no true skeletons, no multi-chambered heart, no limbs, no air-breathing lungs, no placenta, and all number of anatomical features or body plans, as David puts it. But I guess honesty is too costly when it comes to proving the validity of your entirely faith-based belief.
And these creatures are amazingly different from one another, and many, like trilobites, are highly complex.
Not when compared to organisms still alive today. Sure, many appear peculiar and even alien to us, but that does not equate to complex. Our ancestors, for example, didn't even have proper spines to begin with. That came much later. So I'd like to see what method you are using to quantify complexity.
So where did all of these creatures come from? Well, Darwin thought that the ancestors of these creatures were buried in layers that were eroded away before the Cambrian layers were deposited. Now, these missing layers were eventually found, and the creatures found in them cannot be ancestors to the creatures in the Cambrian layers. Researchers also found fossils in the Precambrian layers, the layers below the Cambrian. These organisms are incredibly different from Cambrian creatures, and they can't be their ancestors either. So, the ancestors of the Cambrian creatures have yet to be found. This is a huge problem. It means that the ancestors of all the major animal groups, 30 or 40 of them, simply can't be found. Now, if we can't find the ancestor of all the major animal groups, why should we assume evolution actually happened? The Cambrian explosion casts a huge shadow of doubt on the entire evolutionary story.
Back in reality, meanwhile, said fossils have been found. You're just dishonestly portraying what occurred during the Cambrian explosion. There's no great mystery, we're just trying to fill in all the finer details because the pre-Cambrian fossil record is so poor due to a lack of hard materials, reducing an organism's likelihood of fossilization, but we do have enough to work from. Some lineages have gone extinct, whilst others have a clear relation to other organisms we find before, during, and after the Cambrian. Of course, if you're going to use cyanobacteria from 2,183 million years before the Cambrian as your standard of Precambrian life as you displayed on screen with the stromatolites, then yes, you will have an insurmountable difference to overcome. But that's a result of either your deliberate dishonesty or your self-inflicted incredulity. But if you look at, say, the life forms present during the Avalon period, you will not only find the Ediacarian biota that largely went extinct during the Cambrian, you will find the precursors of species that managed to survive by evolving to stay ahead of the competition and changing environmental pressures. Or you could just use phylogenetics, i.e., the genetic mapping of life, to fill in what are effectively aesthetic gaps in the fossil record. We have enough pieces to see what happened, and your scientific illiteracy doesn't change that fact in the slightest.
What can explain the Cambrian fossils? Well, the global flood of Noah's day described in the Bible. God created all creatures fully formed and functioning, so we wouldn't expect to find ancestors to the Cambrian creatures in the rocks below. As the floodwaters rose, they would have ripped up miles of sediment, redepositing it in layers, trapping and burying billions of creatures. The seemingly bizarre creatures of the Cambrian were perfectly designed for their marine environment, an environment that was destroyed by the flood. And some of those creatures did subsequently go extinct. Now, that's no surprise. Evolutionary ideas can't explain the Cambrian, but the history recorded in God's Word certainly can. Just one more scientific reason that you shouldn't believe in molecules to man evolution. It takes a lot of faith. I'm David Rives. Truly, the heavens declare the glory of God.
Then how do you explain the total lack of any vertebrate fossils beyond that which the scientific theory of evolution predicts should exist in the Cambrian or Precambrian fossil layers? Where is your primordial penguin like the one you displayed on screen? Biology can note valid reasons for a poor Precambrian fossil record in the absence of hard bodies. We do have Precambrian fossils which vary in how alien they are to life we know of, but they're nowhere as frequent. You, meanwhile, have no such excuse. Why don't we see velociraptors buried next to antelope? Why is there a lack of modern-day frogs or any form of amphibian in any layer before the Devonian? Where are the mammals that existed before what we in science consider the Jurassic layers? Hell, why are there no modern mammals before then in any of the periods whatsoever? Your videos do not testify to anything beyond your poor character in failing to actually seek answers to questions you supposedly have. Every field of science refutes the Bible in one way or another. The sooner you realize that, the quicker you can move on with your life and do something with actual value. It's just worth considering. There are a few things which I'd just like to add here at the end of this video. The first is a massive thank you to everyone who has ever donated to me via Patreon. Your fantastic support has given me the ability to keep this channel going, and I hope to continue producing content in the years to come. Secondly, I would like to thank anyone who has ever interacted with this channel. Your shares, likes and dislikes, as well as your comments of both approval and disapproval, have ensured constant feedback allowing me to improve my work. Last of all, I would like to express my desire that you treat any of the people displayed throughout the video with respect. Whilst it is true that ideas do not demand respect, and there are many in fact which deserve reprehension, we must be careful on how we tackle said ideas in ensuring we are not simply targeting the person. In short, be the compassionate side of reason. So take care, and I'll see you next time.